when you go to Corpus Hermeticum 1, all those gifts of the planets become negative attributes, negative dispositions that we then give back to the planets. So that seems to be, according to Wilberg, a very unhermetic thing, because the planets are givers of good in one case, and they're givers of evil in another case. And real true Hermetists don't believe in evil. They don't believe that the cosmos is evil. They don't think that the planets are evil. So if we have a tractate where we're giving up all these evil attributes and we have the 7 administrator planets, that has to be added. Now, again, you may or may not agree with him. And, because this is such a quintessentially Hermetic tractate and people have learned it, that they're very resistant to giving up anything in this tractate. But there's no question that there's real problems with this tractate. Are there any initial thoughts on any of this? This is the philology part. This is, what are we reading? Has this tractate been corrupted, and can we fix it if so? And if not, why not? Thoughts?
I don't want to hog it, but my reaction is to Wilberg. I would say one large piece of evidence against his thesis that the astrological stuff is inserted is ignoring the entire Stobaean Hermetica, because as you just mentioned, that clearly has, astrological content.
Yes, and the astrology is not negative. It's viewed as something basically positive, part of a positive world system.
Yeah, and I guess my other comment would be that it could be both. There's maybe a positive side to the sun and a dark side, or the moon, right? Dark side of the moon, right? That it's just, two different attributes, and ultimately it might not be either. Like whoever was it, Foden was just arguing, that there is ultimately not good and evil, but we can understand these things in more, I don't want to say simpler terms, in something like simpler terms, less ultimate.
Okay.
Anyway.
Okay. Fair enough. Okay. Any other thoughts?
I thought it was kind of interesting. There's more than just like a second creator. It seemed like, you have like all these other like beings. You've got like whatever it is, the council, which could be also called like the will, that is doing stuff. And you've got the word, and then you've got the creator. And then you've got this darkness thing that is more or less giving birth to the fire or whatever. And so, yeah, it's not quite so simple as you would have like with a Gnostic thing, where you just have like, the demiurge. There was like 3 demiurges in there.
Right.
So.
Right. Well, that's part of the problem. So there seems to be duplication. There seems to be duplication of the creator. And it's sort of like the way that Wilberg and others think of it is that whoever has changed this tractate is changing it in the direction of Gnosticism. It's not quite there yet, but it's on its way. Whereas the original Hermetic teaching was purely non-Gnostic, and that it's being moved in that direction with a second lower creator with evil administrator planets. That's a definite move in a Gnostic direction, and that's not original to the tractate. So I think, it's important to get this right, because if we don't get this right, we're going to run into some problems. Any other thoughts?
I'm a little curious, maybe your thoughts on, I don't know, like the timelines or how they may compare to like the Stobaean Hermetica, but like I notice in Copenhagen's notes, there's a lot more referencing to like the Nazarenes and like Gnostic texts and Judaism and Christianity. Like there seems to be, and I don't know if it's just because there's more Greek terms that are shared terminology, or if it's the context and the concepts as well that are coming into this. But I noticed a lot more, like the piece about like the transmigration and reincarnation, those pieces that seem to, it just feels like such a different voice and such a different take on a lot of these things. And even the piece with the 7 planets, like part of what that made me think about, I think a lot of my approach to this is, this isn't necessarily a scholarly thing, but has been through like Hermetic Kabbalah, which is kind of like taking elements of Hermeticism and elements of Kabbalah and seeing where they overlap. And what I really noticed in this is like in the Kabbalah, there's the concept of the Qliphoth, which are like if you took these, those aspects and looked at like the shell of them or like the negative aspects, they sound very familiar to what you're shedding on this reascension back to the Ogdoad. And so there were components of it, again, that felt like much less Egyptian and almost not even necessarily like, yes, Platonic, but also like there were elements that weren't just simply Platonic, but almost seemed to be, I don't know, more in like an Abrahamic religious kind of context or something.
Right. Yes, exactly. And again, this has to do with the editor, because the editor, according to Wildberg, is not only an astrologer, he is bringing in language from the Septuagint. So all this language about increase and increasing, multiply and multiplication, all this language about the introduction of sexual reproduction, that's also added. So that's not Hermetic either. So, I mean, this gets kind of really, really complex when you think about it. And that's why I'm bringing in Wildberg, because so that we can think about it, not so that we can make any final decisions. But yes, there's language brought in that sounds just like Genesis. So either that language was originally there, or whoever is changing the tractate is moving it more toward the creation story in Genesis. I think one of your comments is golden, because if you take as the standard creation story of the Hermetica the Korikosmou, then when you get to the Poimandres, it does look pretty radically different. But I think, as Sean has pointed out, we've got like 5 or 6 different creation stories. And so the question is, which one, or why are they telling so many creation stories that are in fact kind of fundamentally different? I mean, there's not really, like, you can combine them, but it's not that easy, right? So what is the point of telling and retelling these creation stories? Well, one solution is it's meant to focus the mind, to sort of spiritually focus the mind on that moment of creation as the moment in which we best understand who we truly are, which is a mixture of light and dark. Even if you remove the planets, I don't think you can remove from the Poimandres that we are a mixture of light and dark, okay? And because you've got darkness in the beginning and you've got light, and when light interacts with darkness, Sean, you saw some sexual imagery possibly, but when light interacts with darkness, that's when you've got the separation of the 4 elements. But both light and darkness seem to be fundamental. And it disturbs people. It disturbs people like Wouter Hanegraaff as well, who's trying to say that this tractate is actually monistic. But at the beginning, you've got strongly dualistic elements saying the body comes from this dark, watery fluid. That is, your mortal flesh comes from that. But your nous comes from the light of the Logos, and how you got here is not due to any guilt, as in the Christian creation fall narrative, but it is still not your optimal platform, because it doesn't seem to be that you're at your optimal performance when you are life and light that is attached to a fluid darkness, right? Now, people have gotten very, 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 different readings of this, and I want to acknowledge that. Wouter recently, in Hermetic Spirituality, says that, no, this is all about a love story. It's all about nature falling in love with the first human. and the first human is just simply a being of light and life, and he falls into matter, but it's something good, it's something beautiful, it's lovely, the eros, it's all good, okay? But then you have problems here, because if he is depending on the Narcissus myth, and if you're familiar with that myth, it's Narcissus, when he's looking into the pool of water, it's not that he's falling in love with the pool of water. He's falling in love with himself. And so when it's not really a love story, when the male lover, and I'm putting male in scare quotes, but the male lover looks down at nature, and if it was a love story, you would want to say, I think, that that he falls in love with nature. But what I think the story is saying is that nature falls in love with him because he's extremely beautiful, and he falls in love with himself as he is reflected through the mirror of nature. So he's not falling in love with nature, he's falling in love with himself in nature, and that's when he falls, right? Thoughts on this? Brandon, you mentioned this. Do you want to come in here?
That is basically exactly how I was reading it.
Okay. So is this a love story for you? Can this still be love? Because if you know, if this was how I spoke to my wife, I said, I don't love you, but I love myself in you, that would not go over well. That would not go over the
Well,
way.
I think it works in a Platonic way, even a Neoplatonic way, because, for instance, I think what Plotinus is saying in the essay on beauty is that our partial souls, which are all belonging to one great soul, when they meet one another fringe to fringe, when they recognize themselves in another body, that's what beauty is. So all that attraction, that love, eros, it's yourself that you're attracted to in another person.
Right. Yeah, maybe
Yeah.
platonic love is just selfish at the root of it. Maybe selfish is too strong a word. Maybe self-oriented.
Well, it's transcendental selfishness.
Transcendental selfishness, right?
Yeah,
That's
I
the
was
good
going to say
stuff.
something similar. I think monism in general is very hard to think about rationally, but I mean, you could consider, I think I heard this term recently, like a kind of transcendent or divine or whatever prefix you want to put, narcissism, right? Because it's just one. But, and here we are at like lower levels of, that have emanated from monism and still kind of connecting back to that. It's not going to be the same, but uh, yeah, but it's undifferentiated, right? Monism is selfless, right? It's all one self, right? In some sense, and that kind of connects to the idea of these different creation myths. We brought this up in the conventicle, um, that like maybe it's not so much the literary content of the creation myths themselves, believing them literally, as it is the experience of, like you said, getting back to that point of creation that is just after the monad, right? So as a way of understanding the moment, not the moment, but whatever before there were moments, something like that.
Right. Yeah, it's a thought experiment. Yeah. Go ahead. Sorry.
Can I add or go a little further on the
Sure.
Narcissus myth
Sure,
thing?
sure.
So that is only explaining one part of the process, the descent into matter. But the other side, the ascension part, is often seen by Platonists in the Actaeon and Diana myth, where the hunter is in the woods, which is like nature, and is hunting something. It's an allegory. He's seeking God and sees Diana naked, which you're not supposed to do. So she turns him into a deer. He's killed by his own hunting dogs. And what that represents is that the individual, in order to commune with God, has to undergo an annihilation of the self. You have to stop existing as you to achieve henosis.
Okay, okay. Yeah, that's interesting. All right. Yeah, quite lovely. Yeah. Other thoughts?
I was wondering, did you get that Word document that I attached to my email? Are
Oh,
those
yes.
coming through?
Very
Oh, you
long.
did? Okay.
Yes, that's
All
virtually a
right.
commentary.
Yeah.
That's like a line by line commentary. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Because I was kind of talking about, yeah, it was like there's two, I mean, it's like there's two like stories. I mean, you've got, yeah, like with the Word in the darkness, and then you've got the original man with nature. And yeah, but yeah, to me, I don't know. I guess I kind of see it, yeah, that they're both kind of like they're both basically like erotic interactions. They're not and that's actually, I guess the word that's used is like eros rather than like something, or I don't know, the word that comes through is like, yeah, it's like in a sort of an erotic sense or something rather than a um marriage kind of thing going
Right.
on there. I don't know.
Yeah, that's actually the Greek word, which is unfortunate that it doesn't really come through very clearly with Copenhagen. But the love is always eros. It's always the Greek word eros. So there's no ambiguity in what kind of love we're talking about. We're talking about the love of desire and attraction. And I agree with you. I think you can definitely interpret the initial interaction between light and darkness as also sexual or in sexual terms, because I think Copenhagen uses the term mount, and that's one possible translation of the Greek word, which is just epibino, which means can run into or go meet, or I mean, it has some like ambiguity, right?
Mhm.
But it can also mean mount, and so maybe you're right to see that there, which would then explain the offending cause, and it's the line which Hanegraaff, it's kind of like the fly in the ointment of his interpretation, that love or eros is the cause of death, and that's the great weakness of Wouter's interpretation. Again, he's got a way around it, because he just wants to say that that's just talking about biology. People fall in love, they have sex, they have kids, and then the kids die. So that's just biology, right? Um, but the whole revelation is presented as a divine mystery. We're supposed to know the origin of death. That's supposed to be a revealed mystery. It's not supposed to be an obvious fact of biology. So, we're still trying to come to an adequate interpretation of this. I think the overall direction of Wouter Hanegraaff is absolutely correct, that people in the 20th century, they interpreted the fall narrative in a Christian sort of way, because in fact it was like a Catholic priest, André Jean Fastigier, who was doing most of the work, and he interpreted as in a Gnostic way and in a Christian way as something really, really bad, that humanity fell into nature. But Wouter's absolutely right. It can be interpreted as something either neutral or lovely. But I think the Hermetist would never say that that's our natural state. The Hermetist is always trying to say that our natural state is to get back to the life and light. And that's why, even if you don't believe that your flesh is bad, and I don't think that that's the Hermetic position, you still don't think that it's your ideal platform. And so your destiny, your goal, is to realize yourself as purity of light and life. And that is done in inward contemplation. by turning off the gateways of normal perception and going into this more, shall we say, dreamlike or contemplative state, and realizing yourself as the purity of light and light. And that's why I say that this is self-deification. You are, but there's no process to it. You're just realizing who you already are. And that, I would say, is the key insight of the tractate. But there's so much in the tractate that honestly, it's very easy to get distracted, right? And maybe that's also trying to imitate the dreamlike quality of it. Did anyone have any thoughts on this as a dream or as a revelation from a higher being, or as potentially an experience that was ecstatic? Did that strike anyone's fancy?
Well, I picked that up off from the very opening scene
Right.
is telling you that this happened in an altered state of consciousness.
Precisely. Yeah. Yeah. And Wouter, I think he's probably right that there's some sort of preparatory element going in here. I don't think that it's drug related, although it would be very cool if it was, Brooke, because then we could get you to tell us more. I mean, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe, I mean, I could be totally wrong, but I don't see any drugs. I don't even see the name of the person. Like, I think in one sense, it's unfortunate that we call this a revelation to Hermes, because actually it's sort of like a revelation to anybody. And the only person that's named is Poimandres. And I just wanted to make sure, did it make sense to everybody what all this speculation about the name was? Do we need more clarification there? Because there's been a tremendous shift in the past just 20 years about what that name actually means. Was there any?
Yeah, that's something I ran across. That's something I ran across was that, yeah, there's been like three people who've kind of refuted each other since the Kingsley paper. Yeah.
Yes.
So
Right. Right. Yes. I think that the consensus now is that Kingsley was probably wrong, although not far wrong. He was on the right track in looking for the Egyptian context of the name. But what he tried to do, and really he's just perfecting what others had done before him, was to come up with a Coptic phrase that sounded like Poimandres when you translated it, right? And what is actually happening is that this name is the name of a deified pharaoh, and that's the actual referent. And you know, there's some disagreement on how to pronounce that pharaoh's name. You know, the Greeks apparently pronounced it as Poimandres or Poromanes, and it just got tweaked so that it became Poimandres. And then later in antiquity, when they had lost, when basically they had lost any connection to the Egyptian cult and language, they just assumed by a secondary etymology that this was Poimandres, that this was the shepherd of men. Which isn't wrong, because it does also sound like that. It's literally the shepherd of a man. But I think that it's really, really important for us to go back to this Egyptian context and to say that originally this Nous is a deified pharaoh. And I think that's a very interesting thing, that, you know, originally it's an Egyptian priest using someone from the Egyptian, a known person from the Egyptian cult, and using him as the conduit, as the stand-in for the Nous of authority. I think it's a very, very fascinating development, and just another warning for us that we could be missing Egyptian material all the time because we've forgotten it, and it's just not clear to us. Were there thoughts or pushback on any of that?
Who was this pharaoh? Did he have a reputation for wisdom like Solomon or something?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, insofar as all pharaohs are manifestations of you know, they are called Horus in the palace. They are already viewed as incarnate gods and already viewed as, in some sense, incarnating both wisdom and power. This particular pharaoh must have been special because his cult survived hundreds and hundreds of years after his death. In one respect, like the normal kind of life cycle for a pharaoh is they are worshipped after death as gods, every single one of them. But the normal scenario is, you know, the cult doesn't last for more than a few years after their death, and you know, their tombs are forgotten and then they get robbed. But with this particular pharaoh, apparently there was a strong enough memory for this cult to last very, very, very long, far into the Roman period. And they then take this name as the name of the revealer, which is, I mean, whatever we think of it, I think it's a fascinating development.
I don't
So
want to
if
like
the-
go. You can say what you were going to say. I might ask a question that veers a little
Oh,
bit.
thank you, Brooke. My
Yeah.
comment is short. Just that, so if this pharaoh was taken to be, is Poimandres, and Poimandres is the um, noose of Hermes, then the pharaoh is the closest thing to a real human being who is Hermes Trismegistus.
Well, maybe. I mean, he's the closest thing to Ray. Yeah. Because everyone agrees that whether you think it's Poimandres or you think it's Poimandres, that Ray is somewhere built into the name. And so it's deep in the Egyptian cultural memory that the pharaoh in some sense represents the sun god. And that sun, that light element, is what the Hermetist is doing, very similar to the Platonic allegorical writers. They're saying, okay, that light element is the noetic element, because nous is life and light. Okay, and that's why the pharaoh represents, right, the nous. Basically, that's how they make that. That's how they cross that bridge. You know, the details of it we don't really know, but apparently these are the connections that they made. The pharaoh is not typically associated with Hermes Trismegistus himself, but with that higher deity, Ray. Brooke, did you want to come
I
in?
put a link. Oh, I put a link in
Oh.
the chat. That's for the paper,
Excellent.
Zazik,
Appreciate
that discusses the whole theory of Poimandres coming from the name of the pharaoh.
Yep. And this is also in Christian Bull's book, The Tradition of Hermes, in case anyone can get their hands on that. Yeah. The one, I think the first one to come up with it was Howard Jackson. And that article I can send, if you want that article, I can send that to anyone who wants it. The thing with Howard Jackson is it's a very, very technical kind of philological piece. So I preferred to give you Kingsley rather than Jackson. But yeah, if you're really into this, I can send you that as well. Brooke, did you want to come in or?
Yeah, I was just curious how either you or maybe anyone contextualizes, like, I think one of the things that's interesting to me as I read, you know, not just this tractate, some of the others, but I think it's especially true in this one, like, you know, Wouter kind of like speculates a little bit that he thinks that there are potentially mind altering, whether it's incense or other things, but that there maybe have been mind altering substances that are used to achieve these states. I think, like, for me personally, I'm less invested in if a mind altering substance was used and more invested in the fact that the descriptions, not just in Hermetic texts, but other, again, like talking about like samadhi states and things like that in the Veda, it's like there's a real theme in the language and the texts in the language that's used to describe these heightened states. And it certainly absolutely is applicable to certain types of states that can happen with psychedelic substances, but I don't think the psychedelic is the key of it. I think the state is the key of it, and the question is how people are maybe getting there. I'm curious if your perceptions are that people are going into ecstatic states and having these experiences, or if you're reading it as being like metaphorical, and not like something like having a light experience is more just about connection to the sun and to God through this like metaphorical light, or if it is truly this like experience of dissolving into light, into like becoming God on that level.
Oh, I think it's a true experience. Yeah. Where I differ from Wouter is, yeah, I'm less willing to speculate. Like, for instance, as you said, he speculates that there's a use of Kufi incense, and Kufi incense is this incense that is particularly Egyptian and is used in so-called magical spells and so on and so forth. And he thinks that that could be mind altering. I just don't see any particular evidence of that. But what I see as the origin of the mind alteration is the discourse itself. So that, like I said, like these Hermetic tractates, they are designed to bring you to an affective and spiritual climax. So the old word for this is lese mysterium, which is, it's a German word meaning that the mystery is basically happens in the reading. That when you're reading or listening to Hermes talk, that is supposed to generate the mystical experience. It's not anything drug related. It's not anything that is happening in terms of a ritual apparatus. It is the discourse itself that, if it's doing its job, is meant to get you to that higher state, meant to bring you to a breakthrough. And we'll see this played out beautifully. And I think Wouter discusses this beautifully in Corpus Hermeticum 13, which is the rebirth, where he's literally, he's taking him on the path and he's saying, through my words, you're going to have a breakthrough, right? And he does, like he moves him to the point of breakthrough, but it's all through the discourse. It's not through incense. And in fact, as I think Matt or someone mentioned before, that in the Asclepius, they explicitly say, we're not going to burn incense. so if Wouter is wanting to speculate that, you know, incense is somehow a mind-altering substance, he has to deal with that passage as well. And it brings us back to, you know, our discussion last week that, you know, everyone is ritualistic to some extent, right? There's no religious or spiritual group on earth that has totally divested themselves of ritual. But what I would say is, for the Hermetists, as opposed to Theurgists, is Theurgists are on the high end. They're kind of like high ritual, like high liturgy, high church liturgy kind of folks. And the Hermetists are rather on the low end, that they're low church. I'm using those Christian terms, but you know what I mean. Like in terms of ritual, they are actually pretty sparse, right? They do a lot of prayer, but they don't seem to do a lot else, right? The only thing that the Hermetists recommends at the end of Corpus Hermeticum 1 is you got to pray toward the sun as it's going down, right? And that's pretty much it. That's pretty much it in terms of ritual apparatus, right? So there might have been more, but that's all he mentions. So,
I would push back against that a little bit.
Sure, go ahead.
Because I don't think that the lack of evidence, you know, whatever the rest of that phrase is, I think it might just be that there was a lot of diversity in the various gods and goddesses that people might be doing ritual, whether theurgic or, you know, Heka is pretty general, right? So, I mean, it would include what we categorize as low, maybe more goetic kind of magic, and, you know, more theurgic. I think all of that could have been included. And it might just have been so diverse that you don't want to explicitly say anything because all are kind of welcome. You know what I mean? It's just my opinion.
Sure. and everyone, you know, will make their own decisions on this particular point. So, you know, I'm classic straight up historian. I'm just looking for the textual evidence. I think that we'll see other signs of this. For instance, in the discourse in the 8th and 9th, we have another ritual activity that's described, which is you write the discourse on turquoise tablets, and that's something interesting. And turquoise is the color, and it's the stone that Hermes likes. And of course, as Hermetism develops, you know, it's perfectly capable to get more and more ritual elements. I think it was Brandon, you mentioned, is there any interaction with what we call the Greek magical papyri, or the Demotic or Egyptian magical papyri, Coptic magical papyri, and Hermetism? And there might well be, I mean, if you look in the index of these magical spells, they do often, you know, mention Re and Hermes and all these other kind of figures from the Hermetic universe, Agathos Daimon and Knuth and Kamef, and, you know, so they're all there. But what I would say is it's still, when you're reading a Hermetic text versus when you're reading, at least when we're talking about the philosophical Hermetica, it has a very different feel and a very different vibe than when you're reading a Demotic or Greek magical spell. And maybe we shouldn't even call it a spell. It's just what, you know, people did at home. You know, the religious expression, which is more domestic and also more, shall we say, ordinary, in the sense that a lot of what the spells are after is not union with God. Occasionally you get that, but they're more quotidian, that is focused on daily concerns like, can you make this, my next door neighbor, fall in love with me? Or can you get me a new job? Or can I just stop being sick, please? Or heal my stomach. I have stomach pains and there is no pharmacy because modern medicine doesn't exist. So these are the more kind of quotidian concerns of magical spells. Magical, I'm putting in scare quotes. They're just domestic religion in Egypt. So anyway, yeah. Any thoughts on that? Any more thoughts on that? Perfectly
I
fine
think
for
that
people to disagree. Go ahead, Brandon.
I think that Hermetism, if it has a single like opinion about magic, it does seem so different from the PGM that it seems to be a non-interventionist kind of magic, like what Plotinus would agree with, where Plotinus, in some contexts, looks like a magician, but he explicitly says that the work he's doing cultivate inner happiness so that he could find no fault with his circumstances, that the inner man, when he's happy, can't be made unhappy by external things, and that's what he's trying to achieve. So when Plotinus got sick and had chronic stomach problems, he refused treatment.
Okay, yeah, yeah. I would say probably that's not just Plotinus, but probably a lots and lots of people. You know, let's face it, honestly, if I was in antiquity and there was no such thing as ibuprofen or Tylenol or aspirin, you better believe I'd be saying those spells too. I mean, you know, I'd do anything just to get rid of the pain. I mean, honestly, it's not like I'm any better. Believe me, you know. Pain is pain, and you got to get rid of it. And I'll pray to Isis if that gets rid of the pain, you know. All right, but let's get back to the Poimandres. So, any, what did we miss? Other things that people want to talk about?
I thought it would be
I would like to
interesting
just-
to, oh,
Go ahead, Lisa.
no, go ahead, Rob. No,
Thank you.
I wanted to, yeah, go ahead.
I'm just going to resonate again off Dr. Litwa's reference to the Low Church, where I spent the vast majority of my career as a preacher in the Low Church. And I very much picked that up, especially in paragraph or section 27, where, for all intents and purposes, Hermes is sent out as an evangelist, where he says, "I began then proclaiming to mankind the beauty of reverence and knowledge," and gives a little citation. "People, earthborn men, you who have surrendered yourselves to drunkenness and sleep and ignorance of God, make yourselves sober and end your drunken sickness, for you are bewitched in unreasoning sleep." That sounds like so many sermons I have heard.
Right.
So that when you speak about the altered state or the transformation coming from the reading of the word or the speaking of the word, that's just what I picked up on the end of this. And it is similar to a Christian preacher going on and on about, you are already created in the image of God. You are children of God. Act like it, like pick up that dignity that's been given to you and step out into the light of that, which is the call to repentance.
Exactly. Yeah.
And then, of course, there's always beer and wine and cigarettes in the church lobby afterwards to alter one's state a little bit.
Right.
It was a cool church I was a part of.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's interesting that reading Kingsley, he has a bit of an allergic reaction about Hermetism and Christianity. He thinks that, never the twain have met, but the reality is that we don't know exactly when the Poimandres is written. I suspect that it's probably 1st century of the Common Era. But this evangelistic sermon, which, by the way, looks a lot like Corpus Hermeticum 7, just like a boiled down version of that. It's your external Hermeticism. It's your missionary Hermeticism directed toward, everyone else who is asleep or drunk, so on and so forth. That could have been interacted with Christian ideology as well. We just don't actually know. But I think, yeah, the important thing is that for the Hermetists, there's no external savior. The only person that is saving you is the light and life, and that's what you already have. So if we're going to talk about differences, fundamentally differences in terms of the preaching, that does sound vaguely Christian. But in terms of the message, there's no disputing that this is actually quite different from your classic revivalist. Jesus is gonna, by the blood of the Lamb, is gonna wipe out the sin. There really isn't much sin here, and there's certainly not a lot of external savior action. Although I think, Brandon, you mentioned that, Poimandres himself sort of looks like the Christ that meets Paul on the road to Damascus, or maybe it was Sean that you mentioned this. But and that's a very good point. Like this, this is, we don't know really much about Paul, but whatever vision that he had or he claimed to have, it might have looked somewhat similar to this particular vision of Poimandres. And of course, since what we're reading is Egyptian, well, we don't meet Christ, but we meet Poimandres, who is a deified pharaoh. So that's quite interesting. Lisa, anyway, did you want to go ahead?
Sure. One thing that I was thinking about was the actual placement in the order of the texts, how Wildberg has changed the order. And even though the order that they're in with this is number 1, it was a random selection, I guess, to have this be number 1. Going back to what you were saying about reading these texts, drawing you into the mystical experience, I think having this one as the first one, it just brings you right into the center of the feeling of these teachings, and has you dive head first, like into that dreamlike state from which then, you continue through the rest of the tractates. And I don't remember where Wildberg put this in his ordering of things. I didn't check to look before I spoke, but I love having this one first, just from that point of view. And I've heard that same thing said about like the Platonic dialogues, is that the reading of them starts that evolution within you as you absorb, you know, what it's saying. And what was that German word that you mentioned that had that?
A Lesa Mysterium, the reading
Yeah.
mystery. Yeah. I can put that in the chat.
Okay.
This is actually from Richard Reitzenstein, who came up with this word. It's a lovely phrase. It literally means reading mystery. but you gain access to the mystery through reading. Almost like it's a bit Protestant in its mentality, but you know, it's like your private devotions lead you into the mystical experience. I'm just sharing you the Wildbergian order here again. So Wildberg, his edition is going to basically flip the Hermetica. So the general Hermetic teachings is going to begin with 18, go to 7, which again is this external preaching about, you know, deny your body and so on and so forth. Then you got the creation story in 3, and then you've got the pantheistic 11, which we talked about last week. This is supposedly teaching to Hermes himself, and then we get to 1, which is Poimandres. And then next week we're going to switch to teaching of Hermes to Tot. And I just wanted to say a word about this because Brooke raised this as a question. Kopenhauer says, and he's basically repeating this from others, that Tot is just another form of Tot. And so I think in a way that's not so amazing. It could be confusing because Hermes is also Tot, or Thoth if you prefer. And so that could be confusing. It's like Thoth to Thoth. But I think, you know, if these are more or less fictional characters standing in for the dialogue partners, this is like Hermes at a higher initiate level speaking to his lower self. And the same thing with teaching to Hermes. It's the Nous speaking to Hermes is really Hermes's higher self speaking to Hermes, right? His lower self, but at a low stage of initiation. And then when Hermes speaks to Tot, he's transmitting the lessons he's learned from Nous to another disciple who happens to be just another form of himself, just a mirror image of himself, but at a lower stage of initiation. Now, in later Hermetism, you know, this gets developed so that there are 2 Hermeses and 3 Hermeses, and you know, it becomes quite complex. But I just wanted to give you my particular take on that one. So next week we'll do 4, 5, and 8, which are all fairly short, and then we do 12, 10, and 13. This is all Hermes to Tot. That's the largest group, and then finally, we get Hermes to Asclepius, and which we've got in the Corpus Hermetica 9, 6, 14, and 2. And then these 2 baby tractates, teachings to all 3, Tot, Asclepius, and Amon. So again, to reinforce this, you know, Wildberg is not organizing this according to a spiritual pathway. And I resonate with you. I think there was a reason why people like Byzantine scribes put CH1 first. And I think that might go back to antiquity because they felt the same way that you did, Lisa, or that you do. And that's perfectly fine. You know, I think ultimately what will happen is Wildberg will disrupt things for a number of years, but eventually people will just stick with the common order because that's what they're familiar with. So I that's what I prophesy. I don't know what will happen. But yeah, Poimandres as the gateway tractate is still very useful. But then one could raise the question, well, why wouldn't CH13 be a better gateway? Because that's about rebirth. Or why wouldn't CH11 be a better gateway? Because that's like the pantheistic bonanza, you know, where like the world is God and I'm God and you're God, and you know, like that's really cool too. So, you know, a lot of people are going to be picking favorites here. One of the least favorite of Hermetic tractates is CH6, where like Hermes like has a really bad day and starts saying some really negative things about the world, and so everybody's like, no, we don't like that one. And I think Wouter himself would be very, very, you know, open about this and saying, you know, that's probably just not Hermetic. We're not going to read that one. But, you know, everyone's going to have a favorite, right? So in the end, maybe I'll do a survey of what was your favorite one. Any other comments? I'll stop sharing here, but
I was going to say that I don't know if it was in the Copenhagen notes or in where was the other, in Core Cosmo maybe, but yeah, they talk about how, was it Thoth, like Thoth, taught is
Yep.
like the teacher of Hermes Trismegistus, and then Hermes Trismegistus is the teacher of Tat, and then what is it? Agathos Daimon is the actual father of Hermes Trismegistus.
Yep. Yeah, what
Yeah,
happens is,
there's like
they start
a
making
whole-
genealogies, and we don't know how early that is, like, but yeah, it goes Agathos Daimon teaches Hermes, and then Hermes teaches Tot. Yeah, is like the basic genealogy. But Agathos Daimon is not Hermes's dad, and Tot, even though he's called son, is not necessarily the biological son of Hermes. That's just an affectionate term that, you know, continues in the Roman Catholic tradition. You know, you call your priest father, but he's not your dad. In fact, if he was your dad, he'd have to be fired. Although these days, yeah, who knows what they would do. But anyway, long story short,
I had a question along those lines, similarly, where like it seems like a few times now in Copenhagen's notes, like Agatha Daimon is like compared to the Nous or to Poimandres. Like, is that a fair comparison to make, or is that just like one speculation of many? And is separate from all the other context of like Agatha's Daimon, but in terms of the Agatha Daimon, is that equivalent to Nous, or this would be actually two different things?
I think it could be. You know, these Hermetic authors, there's nothing set in stone here. So I think, you know, if history had been a little bit different, this tractate, Poimandres, could have been the tractate of Agathos Daimon to Hermes. And maybe we ought to view Poimandres as the Agathos Daimon, which is simply the good spirit of Hermes himself, and that he's just being called by another more Egyptian sounding name here. Maybe that's the case. All of this is kind of speculation, right? Because as we're going through these Hermetic tractates, you know, the Hermetic authors, they are defining for themselves who the Agathos Daimon is. And I think that it's perfectly fine to think of Agathos Daimon, the good spirit, the good daimon, as as Nous, or certainly noetic. He's Hermes at one level higher, well, maybe several levels higher. He's Hermes's teacher. Yeah. So he could be exactly what Poimandres is, the life and light Nous speaking to the lower self in order to raise the lower self back up to life and light, right? And then Hermes, you know, repeats the favor, so to speak, by taking a new disciple, Tot, who's just a lower manifestation of himself, hence the name. You know, they share the name Thoth. But yeah, as you go into late antiquity in the medieval period, you'll see, especially in the Arabic sources, that they're like, oh yeah, I'm gonna tell you all the Hermeses there were. There were actually 3. You know, and they try to figure this out as if they were doing some kind of like history book. That may or may not be original. It may or may not be the point of all this. I take this as more of like a fictional dramatis persona, you know, players that they're using.
Yeah.
But anyway, I could be wrong.
If I could quickly ask, I've read some things that try to draw correlation between like Agatha Daimon and like the Christos, or like a Christos like idea. And I'm just curious if you think like, can there be parallels drawn, not obviously to like Jesus Christ the person, but the idea of the Christos? Like, do you think that there can be parallels drawn between those two things, or you think they're conceptually like very different?
Well, the rule of history and of theoretical and historical comparison is that anything can be compared with anything else, right? It's only the religious insider that stands up and says, "Hey, no, my religion is incomparable. My God is incomparable. You can't compare my God. Christ is not Poimandres. Get away, get away." But the outsider, right? If we're approaching this as historians of religion, of course, I can compare anything with anything. I can compare Krishna with Christ. I can compare Krishna with Poimandres. I can compare Isis with Poimandres. Just try and stop me. The only thing that will stop me is poverty, because no one will buy my book. But that's the thing. Like, you can do that, and I think it is a fascinating comparison, and it's one of the reasons why, to answer your former question, why Copenhagen has so many notes on the Poimandres, because that's the tractate that Christians like the most, right? Because it's since the Renaissance, it's only been Christian scholars working with the material, and if you were to look at it, you would see in the history of scholarship that tens and tens of thousands of pages have been written on Corpus Hermeticum 1, but virtually nothing has been written on other tractates, like Corpus Hermeticum 11, although I like that just as much, and there's no reason historically why that should be the case. But the fact is, Renaissance scholars and Christians, or people in Christian culture, have been just more interested in the Poimandres, because he just does look a whole lot more like how the Christian God would appear to you, right? Like, it would be in a vision, and he'd be talking to you. And we see this all the time in Christianity as well. We see it in Judaism. So in that sense, it has this more familiar flavor. And they've just kind of ignored the fact that the guy is called Poimandres, right? That he's a deified pharaoh. I mean, we've long forgotten that part. We've just recovered that knowledge literally in the past 25 years. So that's what people like. And that's why Copenhagen has, 30 pages of notes on it, because it's just the history of research. People have, so much focused on it. But we need not. I mean, if it's your favorite tractate, it's your favorite tractate. Go to town.
No, thank you.
Yeah. Oh, well, and one of the things that I should say, like, well, we've already said, is that there's so much. So, each of you should feel free to, send through any kind of questions or topics that we didn't discuss today. I think that really we would be here till midnight, really, if we really wanted to cover even most of the topics in Poimandres. And I know, Brandon, you expressed, that we should be getting kind of deep into this, in line by line, and into the Greek. I would actually love that. And, we can think about a Hermetic 201 seminar down the road. But yeah, this is really, I'm really just trying to do more of a service to kind of prepare all you Hermetists for the great tsunami that is coming. Because once Wildberg finally releases his edition, and we've been literally waiting for him to do so for the past 5 years, he's very careful. Once his edition is released, it will change the nature of the Corpus Hermeticum. And so preparing your minds for the dethroning of Poimandres is a service I'm trying to provide. You may come back and say, this is still my favorite tractate. It should still be number 1. And here's why we shouldn't remove anything. But in order to do that, you've got to understand what's coming, and you've got to be able to deal with it, and oppose it if you want. But you're dealing with an absolute, like, a guy who knows Greek better than probably anybody on earth today. Christian Wildberg is an absolute titan in the field of classics. So we've got to we've got to do this right. Next week, I'll be sure to send out these instructional videos a little bit earlier. I apologize. Sometimes, I just have a brain fart, or I get very, very busy. And so Sean actually reminded me that I hadn't sent out the instructional video. Appreciate that, Sean. But I'll try to get that to you as early as possible, because we will be doing 3 short tractates next week. And I want you all to get a good head start and think seriously about each one. And then send through any reflections or questions. Sound good?
Yes.
All right. Final issues or questions?
Yeah, I guess not a question, but a comment or an observation.
Sure. Please.
Like regarding like the idea that like Hermes teaching that is like higher self-teaching, a lower self, in a way. Like if we go with the idea that like the idea that was present in like tractates so far, like that in a way, like everyone is God in a sense, like in a sense you could actually apply this idea to any other tractate, in a sense of like if everyone in a way, I'm not sure if I am being clear, in a sense of like if everyone in a way is God and God is one, then in a way anyone like on a higher level of, let's say, enlightenment teaching anyone else in a way is one self teaching other self, like to ascend basically. I'm
Right,
not sure
yeah.
if I'm clear.
Well, yeah,
Just
I think that's absolutely right. And since if we are God, then as we learned last week, that we're outside of time, so we can talk to ourselves at different stages of initiation. It's the self that's outside of time talking to the self that's in time. It's, you know, there's a variety of ways of thinking about this. You know, I don't want to present it as too solipsistic, but I do think that these characters, they're all kind of, they do sort of boil down to life and light, right? Like that's what the nous is, and we are nous. And so, you know, I'm talking to you at various stages of your development, but you're talking to me at various stages of my development. We're all one. And it's kind of an illusion, the idea that we're having a dialogue, because we're already life and light. And we're already somewhere, somehow, you know, at perfect union with each other and with God, and enjoying life and light. And it's just, we happen at this present moment to perceive ourselves as separate and in bodies. And maybe if we were in a higher state of enlightenment, we could make all these tractates make sense. I doubt Wildberg is going to go for that solution. He doesn't seem to have a mystical bone in his body. But, you know, I'm trying to do a little bit of balance here. As I said to Sean, like if your spirituality is built on not good philology, then it will ultimately be soup. Have you all seen The Life of Brian? You know, where Jesus is talking at a distance and people are like mishearing him, and they're like, what do you say? What do you say? Blessed are the cheesemakers? Okay, cheesemakers. And then somebody stands up and he's like, oh, it's a spiritual meaning. And he has this lovely, you know, little vignette and discourse on how this makes sense, how cheese making is related to spirituality, which is wonderful and creative and beautiful. But if it's based on an actual misapprehension and misunderstanding of what the text actually says, then it's a different sort of thing, right? Then we're no longer really talking about Sermon on the Mount, or we're no longer really talking about Corpus Hermeticum. So the challenge of you know, Wildberg is, what's the Corpus Hermeticum, right? And that's really what it's all going to come down to. And that's what you all are going to have to decide, whether you're going to read the Renaissance heavily emended Corpus Hermeticum, or whether you're going to read something else. But it's all going to be amended. You know, you're not going to be able to escape the changes as long as we're in the body.
You probably said this, but Copenhagen's is a translation of like the Renaissance Latin, or Copenhagen's is a translation of the Greek?
Oh, it's all Greek. Yeah, we have the Greek.
Okay.
Yeah. He's just using the mid-20th century edition.
Okay.
By which is
Knock.
Knock and Vestigier. Yeah.
Okay.
Which again, the point of reading Poimandres' notes is to show you that he's already dealing with a heavily amended text, and he tells you that this doesn't make sense, or this can be a gloss, or Knock changes this. You know, he says that like every other note. So yeah, that's the reality of the Hermetica. All right, folks. Well, I will see all of you then next week, and send through any questions or reflections. Happy to deal with you. Happy to deal with those and to talk with you during the week. And I think all this stuff is really, really interesting, and all this stuff I hope is really, really helpful to you, and you know, able to kind of give you just a little bit more clarity on a very complex series of texts. So Sean, thanks for that. Yep. If you want to be theurgical on this, I think the final hymn is a good bedtime prayer. That's exactly how you should use it. That's right. Definitely. All right, folks, good seeing you. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Okay.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye.
Good night.